On the 15th of July, 2026, the weekly Niño 3.4 index, the single most watched number in operational climate science, closed at plus 2.1 degrees Celsius above its baseline. That is not a rounding error and it is not noise. It is a reading that, if it holds through the boreal autumn, sits inside the range No A itself labels very strong, one step below the historic ceiling set by the event of 1982 and 83 and matched again in 1997 and 98. The 3-month running average for April through June came in at plus 0.98 degrees, already past the threshold for a formally declared El Niño. 1 month later, June alone averaged plus 1.55 degrees. The ocean did not creep across the line. It ran across it. Nothing about that week looked like a disaster. No coastline flooded, no emergency broadcast interrupted anyone's evening. The Climate Prediction Centre's public statement was a paragraph of careful, almost bureaucratic language. El Niño conditions present, expected to strengthen, advisory in effect. By the next morning, most of the world had not heard about it at all, and the story that did run treated it as a footnote next to the weather. That gap between an ocean doing something historically rare and a public that noticed almost nothing is the whole reason this video exists. Here is the honest question underneath the calm paragraph. Every strong El Niño in the instrument record eventually peaked and let go, the ocean discharging the heat it had built and swinging back toward neutral or even its cold counterpart within a year or two. That has been true for as long as humans have kept a thermometer in this stretch of the Pacific. The open question for 2026 is whether this event is simply the ocean repeating a rhythm it has run for millennia, one more entry in a long, self-correcting record, or whether it is the first one running on top of an ocean that is already warmer than any El Niño has previously started from, which changes what peak and correction even mean. I am not going to tell you the ocean is broken. I am going to walk you through what the data actually says and where the honest uncertainty sits. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do on the channel, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. What happened? Rewind to May of 2026. For months prior, the tropical Pacific had been quietly loading. Downwelling Kelvin waves, pulses of warm water traveling east along the equator beneath the surface, had been ferrying heat out of the deep, warm pool near Indonesia and delivering it toward the central Pacific. In the first weeks of May, the weekly Niño 3.4 anomaly crossed plus 0.5 degrees Celsius and did not look back. That threshold, half a degree above the 1991 to 2020 baseline, is the bar an anomaly has to clear before anyone starts using the words El Niño out loud. By the 11th of June, the Climate Prediction Centre made it official, upgrading its alert from a watch to a full advisory. The wording of that bulletin was blunt in a way these bulletins rarely are. El Niño conditions are no longer forecast, they are present. The ocean had already done the work the models were still debating. That same week, the weekly anomaly stood near plus 1.7 degrees, and the atmosphere, which usually lags the ocean by weeks, had begun visibly falling in line. Trade winds that normally push warm surface water westward into a pile near Australia and Indonesia slackened. Rainfall that normally sits over the far western Pacific began sliding east toward the dateline. The Southern Oscillation Index, a pressure difference measurement between Tahiti and Darwin that serves as the atmosphere's half of the ENSO handshake, fell to minus 24.9 in June and kept falling, reaching minus 30 by the 18th of July. A negative SOI of that size means the normal high-pressure, low-pressure seesaw across the Pacific has essentially inverted. Ocean and atmosphere were no longer just correlated. They were coupled, each one now actively reinforcing the other, which is the mechanism that turns a warm patch of water into a full climate event. By the second week of July, satellite altimetry and buoy data both showed the same picture from different instruments. A deep, well-stocked reservoir of subsurface heat in the central and eastern Pacific, still being fed, with surface temperatures climbing faster than the seasonal norm. No tsunami-style single moment marks in El Niño's arrival. That is what happened between May and July of 2026. Part 2. The hidden structure. To understand why a patch of warm water in the middle of an ocean can reorganize weather on 6 continents, you have to meet the machine underneath it. And that machine is the Walker circulation. Picture a single vast loop of air stretched along the equator, from the eastern Pacific off South America to the western Pacific near Indonesia. In an ordinary year, trade winds blow steadily westward across the ocean's surface, dragging warm water with them and piling it up in a deep, hot reservoir near Indonesia called the Warm Pool, routinely above 29 degrees Celsius. That westward push also drags surface water away from the coast of South America, and cold, nutrient-rich water wells up from below to replace it, a process called upwelling. The result in a normal year is a strong temperature contrast, warm in the west, cool in the east. Warm air rises over the western pool, travels east high in the atmosphere, sinks over the cooler eastern Pacific, and flows back west at the surface to complete the loop. That loop is the Walker circulation, and it is the reason Indonesia is rainy and the eastern Pacific of Peru is normally dry. El Niño is what happens when that loop breaks down. The trade winds relax. Without them constantly dragging warm water west, the warm pool sloshes back east like tilting a bathtub and watching the water find a new level. Upwelling off South America weakens, so the cold water stops surfacing and the eastern Pacific warms. The temperature contrast that powered the whole circulation collapses. The rising air migrates east with the warm water, and the entire loop reorganizes around a new center of gravity. That is why El Niño's effects are never local. You are not looking at a warm patch of ocean. You are looking at the atmosphere's main equatorial engine changing where it sits, and every jet stream and storm track downstream of it shifting to match. Underneath that surface story sits a second, slower one, the recharge and discharge of heat in the deep tropical Pacific over a year or two, governed by the depth of the thermocline, the boundary between warm surface water and the cold, deep ocean. Think of the thermocline as a stretched membrane rather than a hard shelf. Under normal trade winds, it sits deep in the west, near the warm pool, and shallow in the east, near South America, tilted like a ramp. Before an El Niño, heat quietly recharges in the western Pacific, the ramp steepening as more warm water piles up behind it. The event itself is that ramp collapsing, the membrane flattening out and discharging its stored heat eastward and toward the surface all at once. This recharge oscillator framework, built up over decades of work, including that of NOAA oceanographer Michael McFadden at the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, is the closest thing ENSO science has to an agreed skeleton. What is not agreed is the subject of the next chapter. Part 3. The mystery. Here is the genuine, current, unresolved argument inside ENSO science, and it is not academic. It is the reason forecasters are struggling to tell you how bad this one will get. For decades, the Oceanic Niño Index, a 3-month running average of the Niño 3.4 anomaly against a fixed 1991 to 2020 baseline, has been the official yardstick. It is simple, consistent, and comparable across time. But the ocean it is measuring is not the same ocean it was 30 years ago. Background sea surface temperatures have risen with the climate as a whole, so a Niño 3.4 reading of plus 1.5 degrees today reflects less added heat relative to the ocean's new normal than the same reading did in 1982. In February of 2026, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center formally adopted a second measure alongside the ONE, the Relative Oceanic Niño Index, or RONI, which subtracts the long-term warming trend before classifying the event. In most cases, RONI quietly dampens the apparent strength of an El Niño and sharpens the apparent strength of a La Niña. This one is the exception. Even with the warming trend stripped out, this event still reads as strong to very strong, which tells scientists the anomaly itself, not just the warming baseline underneath it, is unusually large. Independent climate researchers tracking the shift describe it in similarly blunt terms. One July analysis calling the ocean's move toward an unusually intense event nothing short of stark. A description that would normally read as hype, but here matches the raw instrument readings underneath it. That single fact is driving an unusual convergence in the forecast models. As of June's model run, every one of 13 major global forecasting centres had its median projection peaking at or above the threshold for a strong event. 11 of those 13 centres project the event reaching the informal very strong or super El Nino tier. 8 of 13 project a peak that would exceed the historically observed maximum from the 1982 to 83 event using the newer climate adjusted index. Model agreement at that level is rare. Models built by different institutions, run on different physics, almost never line up this tightly this far in advance, and when they do, forecasters take it seriously rather than dismissing it as coincidence. But agreement between models is not the same as certainty about the physical mechanism, and this is where the real scientific tension sits. ENSO's theoretical foundation has two competing explanations for why an event builds, peaks, and then collapses. The delayed oscillator framework, developed independently in the late 1980s, explains the turnaround as a wave reflection problem. Warm water sloshing east eventually reflects off the ocean's western and eastern boundaries and returns as a cooling signal, arriving with a built-in time lag. The recharge oscillator framework, refined through the 1990s and 2000s, explains the same turnaround as a heat budget problem. The event itself exports so much warm water east and toward the surface that the Western Pacific runs a deficit, and that deficit eventually starves the event of the fuel it needs to continue. A 2024 synthesis by oceanographers Takeshi Izumo and Fei Jin, among others, proposed a hybrid model combining both mechanisms, arguing they operate in different parts of the basin simultaneously rather than competing to be the one true explanation. That paper is recent, contested, and not yet the consensus. Which mechanism dominates in any single event changes how sharply the models expect it to turn over. And right now, for this specific event, the models are not fully agreed on when or how sharply that turn happens. That is the honest mystery, not whether this El Nino is real, the instruments already settled that, but how it ends, and how much of what we thought we understood about strong events applies to one starting from a warmer baseline than any before it. Part 4. The Historical Echo. The reference point everyone reaches for is the event of 1997 and 98, and for good reason. By the traditional own eye measure, it stands as the strongest El Nino ever instrumented, narrowly ahead of 1982 to 83 by some metrics, and behind it by others depending on which region of the Pacific and which index you weight most heavily. Climate researchers Klaus Walter and Michael Timlin, comparing the two events directly, found the 1982 to 83 episode stronger in the more western Niño regions and in atmospheric pressure measures, while 1997 to 98 was more intense specifically off the coast of South America. Neither team declared a clean winner. That disagreement between two of the strongest events on record, even after the fact, with every instrument reading already in hand, is itself a warning about how much confidence to place in any single number describing an event still underway. What 1997 and 98 actually did is well documented. It temporarily raised global air temperature by roughly 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-event baseline, compared with an average bump of around a quarter of a degree in a typical El Nino year, a difference of 6 times the ordinary effect. An estimated 16% of the world's coral reef systems died in the heat stress that followed. Damage estimates for the event itself ranged from $32 to $96 billion depending on methodology. And a later economic reconstruction by researchers Christopher Callahan and Justin Mankin, published in the journal Science, put the total global economic loss in the 5 years following the event at roughly $5.7 trillion once you account for the slow drag on growth across dozens of affected economies, not just the immediate storm and flood damage. The 1982 to 83 event, the other member of this small club of very strong El Niños, arrived with almost no warning under the forecasting tools of its day, since the dedicated Tropical Pacific Observing Network that later caught 1997 and 98 in exhaustive detail did not yet exist. It drove severe drought across Australia and Indonesia, catastrophic flooding across Ecuador and northern Peru, and an unusual run of Pacific storms far from their normal tracks. Both of the historically strongest events, in other words, produced the same broad signature: drought on one side of the Pacific, flood on the other, and a scramble of storm tracks in between, even though the two events differed in exactly which sub-region of the ocean ran hottest. Here is what that analogue can tell us, and what it honestly cannot. It tells us that an event of this rough magnitude has historically reorganised rainfall enough to produce both severe flooding, largely across the southern tier of the Americas, and severe drought, largely across the western Pacific and parts of southern Africa in the same season. It tells us the scale of economic disruption is not hypothetical. It has already happened once, on the record, at comparable ocean temperatures. What it cannot tell us is how a comparable ocean anomaly behaves stacked on top of nearly 3 decades of additional background warming, more moisture already loaded into the atmosphere, and sea levels several inches higher than they were in 1998. The analogue is a flaw for how seriously to take this, not a script for exactly what happens next. A story with numbers this large attracts readings the data does not support, so let's walk through the ones already circulating and deal with each honestly. The first is the claim that a strong El Niño is evidence the climate system is now collapsing or entering irreversible runaway warming. It isn't. El Niño is a natural oscillation that has run on this planet for thousands of years, visible in coral and ice core records long before industrial emissions existed. What has changed is the baseline it operates from, which is a real and serious signal about the trend underneath, but that is a different claim from the oscillation itself breaking. A strong El Niño riding on top of a warmer ocean is exactly what climate models have long predicted would eventually happen. It is confirmation of an expected pattern, not evidence of an unpredicted collapse. The second is the claim, and you will see versions of this online within weeks if you have not already, that this event was engineered or amplified by weather modification programs, ionospheric heaters, or deliberate government intervention. There is no physical mechanism by which any known technology could move heat on the scale required to warm hundreds of thousands of cubic kilometres of the equatorial Pacific by a full degree or more. The energy involved in a strong El Niño's redistribution of ocean heat dwarfs the total output of every power plant on the planet combined many times over. Nothing humans have built operates at that scale, and no credible mechanism for one has ever been demonstrated. The third is the claim that this El Niño will trigger a surge in major earthquakes, sometimes framed around the added weight of shifted ocean water loading the crust. There is a genuine narrow body of research on tiny, statistically subtle correlations between large-scale ocean and atmospheric loading and very specific types of shallow, already stressed faults, but it describes a marginal nudge on faults already near failure, not a triggering mechanism for major earthquakes generally, and it has never been shown to meaningfully raise seismic hazard at a global or even regional scale. The physics of plate tectonics operate on forces many orders of magnitude larger than a shift in ocean loading, and no strong El Niño in the historical record, including 1982, 83, or 1997, 98, produced a detectable global earthquake surge. And the fourth is the flattest but most common one, that this event guarantees a repeat of 1997 and 98 specific disasters, region for region. It doesn't. Every El Nino reorganizes rainfall along the same broad global template, wetter in some places, drier in others, but the exact regional severity depends on details. Background, sea surface patterns elsewhere, the state of other oscillations, even the timing relative to the seasonal cycle that vary event to event. The broad pattern is a reasonable expectation. The precise forecast for any one city is not something this data on its own can hand you months in advance. There is a fifth claim worth naming because it sounds more reasonable than the others, that the adoption of the relative oceanic Niño index in February of 2026 was itself a kind of statistical trick designed to manufacture a more dramatic story out of an ordinary event. It wasn't. Ronnie was developed to correct a real, previously acknowledged blind spot, the fact that a fixed baseline slowly falls out of date as the background ocean warms, and in most historical cases, it has made events look milder, not more dramatic, precisely the opposite of what a trick designed to inflate a story would do. That this particular event stays strong under the more conservative index is a data point against the manipulation claim, not evidence for it. Part 6. The three readings. Reading 1, the routine interpretation, and the one with the most support. This is a strong El Nino, developing quickly, consistent with the natural range of ENSO variability, riding on a warmer background ocean than any prior event. Nothing about its onset falls outside understood physics. This is the reading centered by the data. Reading 2, the watch and see interpretation. The model convergence toward a very strong or record peak between November of 2026 and January of 2027 is unusually tight, and the Roni framework confirming strength even after removing the warming trend is a real signal worth tracking, not dismissing. If the Southern Oscillation Index keeps falling through August and the subsurface heat reservoir keeps refilling rather than discharging, that would support the higher end of the model range. This reading belongs in your back pocket, not your headline, until the Climate Prediction Center's next diagnostic discussion confirms or walks back the trend. Reading 3, the alarmist interpretation that this event signals a broken climate system, an engineered anomaly, or a global seismic trigger, does not survive contact with the physics or the historical record, and I'm setting it aside rather than pretending it deserves equal weight with the other two. Picture the same instruments a little over 2 months from now on that second Thursday of August when the Climate Prediction Center issues its next diagnostic discussion. The Niño 3.4 boys will still be reporting every 6 hours, patient and indifferent to the noise building around them online. Most likely, what they show will be more of the same. Continued strengthening, continued coupling between ocean and atmosphere, a number that keeps climbing toward, and quite possibly past, the historic range. Not impossibly, something in the pattern could stall or shift. The atmosphere and ocean occasionally decoupling in ways the recharge oscillator and delayed oscillator frameworks both struggle to fully anticipate. The honest position is exactly that narrow. The data supports real concern about scale, and it supports genuine, still open uncertainty about the mechanism and the peak. It does not support panic, and it does not support dismissal. Widen the lens far enough and this single event nearly disappears. The Pacific has been running this same oscillation, warm phase and cold phase, for longer than there have been humans to name it. Coral cores and ice layers carry its signature back thousands of years, long before anyone was measuring it on purpose. It ran through the last ice age. It will run long after this particular event finishes discharging its heat and the ocean swings back toward neutral, probably sometime in the back half of 2027, and it will run again after whatever event follows this one finishes too. The clock keeps running. What is different this time is only the floor it's running from, a few tenths of a degree higher than any prior strong event has started with, and that difference is exactly small enough to be easy to dismiss and exactly large enough to be worth watching closely. As we covered on the channel with an earlier NSO update, the pattern always looks obvious in hindsight and uncertain while it's happening. This is the uncertain part. Treat it that way.